Hello, everybody. My name is Oliver Laasch. I'm the author of the textbook Principles of Management, Practicing Ethics, Responsibility, and Sustainability. This particular session is a very short introduction to the topic of ethical management for the course taught by Nicolas Li at the University of Dundee, but obviously open for everybody else here on YouTube as well. So what I will do is to give you a quick run through using some of the slides of this chapter 3 on ethical management. So let's start with a case really. So I assume many of you have heard about Fairphone. So Fairphone is a company, originally actually not a company, originally a social movement, but now a company producing phones that are more fair than other phones. So fair being an ethical, a normative concept, a value as well, the value of fairness. I think this is an excellent case for us to get into the topic of ethical management. And the very positioning of Fairphone itself as an organization and of all of their management and managerial practices is to see how can we make that more fair. So fair, for instance, in terms of the kind of minerals that go into phones, go into the screens and all of the electronics of it inside, which often in the past, particularly tungsten as one of the minerals, has been sourced from conflict areas. And phones, de facto, have been fueling conflict, have been making or financing war because of those sourcing practices. But also think about how phones are unfair in the relationship between human beings and the environment, because we do have very considerable environmental impacts from waste, for instance. So building phones that cannot be repaired is a crime against the environment, if you want so. So that managerial practice, in this case, in the R&D and innovation and design space of phone production and general of consumer electronics production, this is something else that they're tackling, and many other things as well. So, and the idea here is that many management practices, although explicitly we don't call them ethics management, so the management of ethics as a discipline, do have very strong normative and ethical dimensions. And what Linda Trevino is saying here, that managers engage in decision-making and behavior all the time, affecting the lives and well-being of others, that makes it a morally relevant an ethics topic itself. And that means that ethical management really is about two things. It is about practicing management ethically, so doing your normal managerial job in an ethical way, but also engaging into practices that we could call ethical practices. So practices that actually have some kind of good normative purpose. So the distinction would be, for instance, practicing management ethically would be, imagine you're managing a small team and it's about overwork. And work-life balance for the people on your team. So doing your job as a supervisor ethically, practicing management ethically, would be, for instance, that you make sure that people are not being forced by your behavior into overwork. Engaging into ethical practice, on the other hand, for instance, would be you are somebody who's in charge of an ethical sourcing practice, or somebody who is engaged in a cause-related marketing campaign, a campaign that tries to further some kind of moral cause, everything from supporting children's welfare to environmental impact causes could be subject of a cause-related marketing campaign. So I think you see the difference. One is doing your normal practices in an ethically good way, or actually engaging into practices that do have some kind of normative ethical purpose. So this then means that we do have to look at that bigger picture here. So ethical management then, if you're just thinking about the nuts and bolts of it, it is about evaluating ethical problems, behaviors, and finding management tools that help us to address those problems and respectively good or bad ethical behaviors. And then the idea is that out of that we get some kind of ethical performance, once again affecting those very decisions and behaviors that we evaluated before. And that can happen on many different levels. So it could be the ethical system overall, so the system of the economy of a certain industry. So fair, for instance, is a case of ethics management at the industry level, because their stated purpose is to transform the consumer electronic consumer goods industry overall in order to become more fair, so to become more ethical. But then also the organizational level is one, or also the individual and group level. So you could have, if you consider yourself a professional, so similar to doctors, lawyers, and firefighters, police people, and so on, you could make a case that management actually does have a important role to play in society, just as those other professions, and you develop your personal professional ethics of what you do as a manager and what you don't do as a manager, how you practice your own jobs. That would be an example for the individual level. But often we actually cannot separate it out neatly into different levels. So think, for instance, about big pharma and the related ethical issues. So it is, of course, an individual question of managers making decisions and managerial behaviors. So for instance, if you're thinking about somebody who is in charge of pricing strategies for your pharmaceutical products, for medicines, for any kinds of drugs, because you can, for instance, think, so what do my pricing activities do? So how do they enable or keep people from accessing those kind of condition well-being improving or changing kinds of products that medicines are. But then also on the organizational level, what is the organizational policy? For instance, in one of the early editions of the cases, we had a very, back then, kind of very progressive case of GlaxoSmithKline, who started, one of the big pharmaceutical companies, who started to have differential pricing, where they would price medicines sometimes even at cost in developing countries in order to increase access. So that would be an organizational level policy and related to ethics and ethical management. And then again, the systems level, just as in the case of Fairphone or in the case of Big Pharma. Well, the question, pharmaceutical companies in general, does it become a normal institutionalized practice to price a pharmaceutical product in order to give access to people who need it in many different ways? And of course, that's a topic that becomes even more topical right now when we're thinking about COVID, the whole discussion about countries holding back vaccines, prices of vaccines going being at the same level in different countries. And because of that, immense problems and reinforcing inequalities between companies in terms of the welfare of people living there. So, and often ethics is related to this academic discipline of moral philosophy. So knowing what is right and what is wrong based on ethical decision-making frameworks. We talk more about later on, but then business ethics isn't just on the philosophical level or ethical management, which is one type of business ethics, because it is an interdisciplinary study of ethical problems in business. And why is it interdisciplinary? Because we have different areas. So we do have moral philosophy in there in order to know what is right and wrong in a more formalized way. We also do have psychology in there, so particularly the idea of behavioral ethics, to study why do people take right or wrong decisions, engage in right or wrong behaviors, but then also management as a sociological field discipline, which helps us to understand what kind of social tools can we actually use in order to manage ethics. So think about codes of ethics, for instance, or ethics trainings and so on. So we already talked about those different levels of application. So that's a nice visualization, but we don't need to go much deeper into that one. Then an important part here is, of course, the application of those different disciplines, or how important those different disciplines are in ethics management, changes or varies, of course, depending on what kind of ethical problem we encounter. And I think this quadrant here is really interesting and really helpful in order to get our head around what kind of tools or what kind of thinking can we use in order to address a certain problem. So for instance, there are the ones where we have the genuine ethical dilemma over there, the green one, where we actually want to do the right thing, but it's not quite clear what the right thing is. So the ethical judgment is unclear, the moral motivation is high. And this is what we usually suppose the type of ethical problem is. Because then the point or it comes down to moral philosophy, to using different ways of reasoning to find out what the right thing actually is. But again, this in practice is not the most prominent one of prominent type of ethical problems. Often ethical problems are actually compliance problems. So the opposite end over here in this figure, the red one, where it's actually very, very clear what the ethical, what the right course of action would be, but the motivation to do so is low. And there can be many different reasons for that. And psychology helps us to find out what those reasons might be. It might be reasons related to situational factors, for instance, the climate of the organization, individual factors, the type of people working there, and certain psychological dispositions that they have to engage in ethical or unethical behavior or not. So the idea is then that it becomes ethical management becomes something that we have to look at through many different lenses. And of course, that also relates to our values, not only our values individually, but also the values of the workplace, or the values of an entire industry, or the values of a country or culture. So this is a very important aspect when you start making those decisions. So different domains of business ethics. We already mentioned those before, but I just want to go a little bit deeper because I think this is really important. So we do have moral philosophy, which gives us the normative dimensions, the question, what is right and wrong? It helps us evaluate situations. We do have behavioral psychology. Descriptive ethics is one of the big labels we put in that field, and it helps us explain how come that somebody does the right thing morally or not, or take certain decisions that are good or not. And then finally, we do have management studies, and particularly the sociological part of how do we use managerial tools in order to, once we know what would be right and we have explained why people don't do it, to then identify the right management tool to actually address that issue. Good. So now we're going to go through those three different areas in order to know a little bit better what contents we can expect there. And of course, this can only be a quick overview. So in terms of moral philosophy, finding out what right or wrong means in a certain context, we typically refer to those three big areas. And I want to start with consequentialism on the right. So there, the idea is to judge by the outcome. So what is the consequence or the consequences of one or a different course of action, of one or a different decision? And then we do have deontology, and typically, so following higher rules and principles. And typically, the example people use, because it's a very straightforward one, is that of the golden rule, where you're saying, well, don't do anything to others that you don't want to be done to yourself. Dumbing it down a little bit, but that's the basic message. Or we would have virtue ethics, and virtue ethics is very interesting because it brings the person back in. So it's not a removed rule that we're following. It is not a removed outcome, removed from the process. It actually brings in the person very strongly. And in virtue ethics, we're not judging people by their individual behavior, individual action, but we see it in context, in the longer history of a person. So we're seeing how come that this person did this in this particular situation. Is that person does that person show a certain integrity? Is that person able to enact their values across many different situations? And depending on how easy or difficult it is in different situations, we might actually still think somebody is an ethical person based on the virtue ethic lens, although at some points in time they might have done something unethical, because we take that bigger picture perspective. Good. So this is quite helpful, but everything we see in there is really about human beings, but there's barely any human beings around anymore, I would argue, because we, all of us actually are intimately entangled with technologies. And sometimes, so when I'm thinking about smartphones, when I'm thinking about wearable tech, if you're thinking about kind of prosthetic, kind of further development of wearable techs, if you think about how we connect to the socio-technological system around it, for instance, how we commute, how easy or difficult it is to take your bicycle instead of the car, for instance, depending on roads quality, how people follow the rules, the bicycle pass system, how many cars you've got on the road, what type of cars it is, and so on. So we are intimately entangled with technology. So that makes it much more difficult, because it's really hard to judge ethical behavior based on an individual person. It is, and based on the human component of it, because depending on how we're tied into that system, technological system as well, we cannot really say, well, it was that person's decision, because there are so many forces that are taking the decision with us, engage in the behavior with us. And if we go all the end to the other end of the spectrum, you can even think about technological ethics, or ethics of artificial intelligence. For instance, in one of the other chapters, I have this case where, and that happened to me, where I was looking for an interesting case on child labor, and I would Google it. And the first thing that pops up is an ad by eBay saying, oh, cheapest prices on child labor here on eBay. This was not a person taking that decision to offer that ad to me. It was the technology, it was the AI behind it, it was the algorithm itself. But then again, how do we judge a moral outcome like this? And another example is this here from the artificial pollination industry. I don't know if you folks have ever watched the series Black Mirror, which thinks technological developments through in their consequences. So there was one case where actually what we already have, drones, for instance, pollinating plants, and they had taken it to the extreme there, that actually those drones, artificial small bee robots, would be able to reproduce based on nanotechnology, something that we actually can do already. Because of something in the algorithm that was meaning to protect kind of society, they actually started killing people. So particularly killing people that were particularly kind of dangerous or counter or problematic for society. So how can we judge that then? So the problem here is really that it's not only human we're judging, but the second field that we're going to talk about is behavioral ethics, or also descriptive ethics. And there we typically talk about individual and situational factors. So this point about technologies acting with us is really important there. But still, it's very human-centric, and I would like to invite you to think beyond that as well. But what they do is basically think about, well, what's the ethical awareness of that person? So in order to explain a certain ethical behavior decision, they think about what's the ethical awareness, what kind of judgment have they made, so based on what kind of theory, for instance, or what kind of framework, or what kind of judgment rule, or what kind of values. Then the ethical motivation, for instance, were they trying to do good, or were they actually trying to actively do bad? And based on the behavior, what's the actual outcome, what did they do? And the idea is that all those three go together in judging and identifying the factors that go into certain ethical decisions and behaviors. And of course, the situational and the individual factors are really important, once again, also in different ways. So here's this one example, a real example, where somebody was actually able to write an algorithm themselves in order to do their job. So and that person then reported that I've got the reference in the chapter. So that person actually reported that they were able to do their job, for which they were paid full-time within just 2 hours a week. That's interesting, isn't it? Is that good or bad? Some people might say this is very bad, because you're being paid for doing a full-time job, but you're only working 2 hours a week. Or somebody might say it's good, great, because that person is still getting their job done, but they can also live their personal life to the full, maybe even take on other jobs or hobbies and so on. So it's a really, really complex kind of setting. But there's the individual factor, of course. Are you somebody who's able to do that? That's one of the main points. Are you competent enough to do that? But also the situational factor, for instance, what influence does that have on that organization, or how does the organization also influence that ethical decision making? Maybe that person was just sick of their job because the organizational climate is so bad. They said, okay, I want to really work for this organization as little as possible, and I'm going to find a shortcut to get the work done without having to engage or even think about that organization every day. a week for 7, 8, 9, 10 or more hours. Good. And then last area is ethics management. And if you have a very kind of stylized, cleaned up version of the ethics management process, there are those 3 areas. You evaluate a problem, and we already have seen that there's a variety of different problems out there which require very different approaches. And then we explain the behavior and the decision making, and then we apply tools. So once again, we have those 3 disciplines of ethical management, of business ethics coming together. But the idea is that that process overall then leads to some type of performance, which we could call moral excellence, or maybe moral flaws if it's not, or lack of moral excellence if the outcome is not a very positive one. And of course, there's different contexts in which that happens. So if you think about the yellow one first, specialized ethics management, that would be somebody who is, for instance, the ethics officer of an organization, or the compliance manager, or sometimes you also have people dedicated to particular areas with moral implications. So for instance, equality, diversity, inclusion management, of course, is one of those areas. So also, if you think about some of the social responsibility areas, if you're a community engagement manager, for instance. And this is the first one. So it's specialized. It's a certain area that somehow is concerned with ethics, and typically is people who have been trained for that, in particular, to manage ethics. While the other one, mainstream ethics management, is much closer to what we called ethical management early on. So you do your normal managerial job, and you do it in the best way possible when it comes to right or wrong, morally right or wrong behaviors. So in this is this emphasis really on behavior. So ethical management behavior, particularly in your personal sphere of influence. And depending on what kind of job and role description you have, your sphere of influence might be that you do normal management ethically, or it might be that you are engaging in particular ethics management practices. So the ones that we mentioned before. Good. And very often, actually, it is that ethics or unethical behavior has been normalized to a very high degree. I just had an interesting experience with my own university, actually, where it comes to how you top off courses and what are the implications for the people working on that course, particularly work-life balance and potentially problems being able to keep up with the workload. But I don't want to go much deeper into that. But generally, the problem is that often we actually have ethical problems that have been normalized and are not being opened up anymore. So for instance, think about institutionalized overwork, where the organizational policies are built in a way, and because of the policies, managers behave in a way where overwork becomes normal. So one really, really important aspect of ethical management is actually opening up those normalized unethical behaviors and making them attackable again in a certain way, and trying to find out what we can do about it. But obviously that's not very easy. Good. And I just want to close with giving you one more really, really interesting case to possibly look into. Pia Poppenreiter is one of my previous students back in Berlin, actually. And she, after writing her thesis on social entrepreneurship business models, actually went on and created a business, a venture called Olala, which was a paid dating app. So you could, some people have said this is basically a prostitution app. This is what some of the big newspapers have called it. But at the same time, she did that out of a very strong moral hunch, where she actually saw on Berlin streets, saw prostitutes standing in the bad weather and seeing how little protected they were in many different ways. And she thought, maybe with my technology expertise, I could do something about that, give them a more protected, safe space where they are in control. So a very controversial case, because it clashes, has tension with so many societal norms. It's typically a topic that typically is very taboo. And also there's the interesting tension between personal motivations and how things are seen from the outside. So I really want to encourage you to look at this case particularly as one of the cases that we have in the chapter towards the end. And of course, it would be interesting to discuss that when we have our live session in Dundee. So that could only be a very quick overview. So please make sure that if you're interested in some particular contents here, have a look at the book. It's chapter 3 on ethical management. And of course, I'm very much looking forward to hearing from you, commenting on that video, connecting me on LinkedIn, and so on. Let's be in touch.